Be constantly aware of how our leadership influences the behaviour of others. I remember when I was working in a local authority, and there was a guy who worked in my senior team. He was very smart and very professional and polite. And I thought he was doing a decent job. And one of my finance people came up to see me and said, there's an issue with this man's budget. We'd like to have a look at it. I said, okay, I'm sure it'll be nothing. So they had a look at it, and they found that he'd been paying his mortgage out of public funds for years. Now, of course, I was shocked, and of course he went to prison. But I had to ask myself, how had he been able to get away with it? Why were the systems that I had as chief executive not robust enough to stop him getting away with it? That was the first question I asked. And my second question is, what was it about my style of leadership that made him think he could get away with it? And actually, I was so focused on the school improvement bit of the job, I wasn't focused enough on making sure people couldn't steal money. And I really, really had to ask myself some hard questions about how my behavior as a leader was leading to incentivizing behavior that was not acceptable. In the 1990s, the management of Sears Roebuck gave car mechanics a big increase in dollars per hour if they completed more car repairs at a faster rate. The employees responded by repairing things that weren't broken. The management had helped to turn the workforce into liars and fraudsters. The behavior of the management leading to behaviors in the workforce that were not foreseen. When our colleagues in our organizations behave in undesirable ways, it's a good idea to ask ourselves as leaders whether our own behaviors and our own systems are actively encouraging them to do so. Now, I've had the privilege over the last 12 years or so of visiting large numbers of schools in England and indeed now all over the world. I've seen it firsthand the difference good, effective and principled leadership can make and the impact of poor or weak leadership. I've had my own assumptions challenged by that experience. I've had to ask myself some hard questions about morality and principles. I've been shocked by what I've seen internationally in terms of corruption, abuse and complacency in some education systems. But I've also been moved to tears by the moral courage I've observed from leaders in schools across the systems and across the world. And we should never, ever, ever underestimate the power we have as leaders, either to do good or to do bad. And we'll always be sensitive to unintended consequences as a result of our leadership. The third one is to foster trust as the basis for successful leadership. You don't need to tell me that the parental trust that you have is gold dust. And if you don't have the trust of a parent, it is so, so frustrating and time-consuming. So reaching out and building up trust with the community, with the parents, is really, really important. But winning trust from teachers through principled leadership is also extremely important. I don't know whether you're familiar with the book, Why Should Anyone Be Led by You, by Goffey and Jones. It says there are two reasons why people will want to be led by you. The first is, are you authentic? Have you got integrity? Are you not playing games? Are you honest? Do you admit mistakes? Are you in it for the right reasons? Do you have moral purpose? And the second reason is to think you might know what you're doing some other time. So those are the two reasons. Those are the two reasons why people will follow you. And the first one about authenticity is really, really important. It's important, therefore, that we demonstrate ethical leadership because that means people are more likely to want to be led by us. But I think we've also got to ask ourselves how important it is that children and young people in our care trust us and trust teachers, that we role model the values that we promote, and that as leaders we create an environment where young people can grow up and develop their own set of principles and become good citizens and humane adults. And this is at the heart of what schools are about. Not just the curriculum taught, colleagues, but the curriculum lived. The curriculum lived by leaders and by teachers. And that's ultimately down to the culture that leaders create in their schools. It's influenced by our own behavior as leaders. But a particular challenge is how we establish trust, not just within our school, with teachers and children, not just with parents, but with other schools. And that can be challenging. I think a simple way to build that trust and collaboration between schools, especially if you're finding it difficult, is to practice an act of kindness. Go out of your way to help another school with nothing expected back. Trust and reciprocity are intricately linked. If you show kindness and help to one school, they're more likely to show kindness and help back. Don't wait for them to do it first. You show them it first, and then you might get something collaborative going. So the fourth area I want to talk about is being open and welcoming challenge. I don't know whether you saw this quote from Barack Obama just before he left as president of the US. For too many of us, it's become safer to retreat into our own bubbles, whether in our neighborhoods or our social media feeds, surrounded by people who look like us and share the same political outlook, and never challenge our assumptions. And increasingly, we become so secure in our bubbles that we accept only information, whether true or not, that fits our opinions, instead of basing our opinions on the evidence that's out there. A really, really interesting quote. I think the Brexit referendum was a good example of this, by the way. Whole swathes of Remainers only had contact with other Remainers. Whole swathes of people who wanted to leave the EU only had contact with people who wanted to leave the EU. So everyone was surprised when we got the result. We increasingly live and work in atomized and divided groupings where we choose whose views we listen to. And we can more easily than not cut ourselves off from those who disagree with us. If we don't like them or don't agree with them, we simply unfriend them on Facebook or we block them on Twitter. Agatha Christie said, "The secret of solving a crime is keeping an open mind as long as possible. The moment you make up your mind as to who committed the crime, you only see the evidence that fits your thinking. Or even worse, you make it fit your assumptions." And I think we should be very wary of groupthink. Groupthink within schools and groupthink within MATs. Those who operate a single closed mindset, thinking there's only one way to see the world, that only certain beliefs are acceptable, and don't open themselves up to the wider evidence base and welcome challenge. And it's important in our own organizations to operate in the same kind of way, to encourage others to speak truth to power, the leadership being the power. Or do our staff, do our colleagues just say what they think we want to hear? Are we prepared to change our mind and openly admit it when we get things wrong? Today, lots of organizations build into their culture an obligation to dissent. This comes from the management consulting firm McKinsey, but it's common across business and public sector. When there's a complete agreement on an important decision, for example, this could be seen as a sign that more time is needed for debate. In any given meeting, the most senior manager should actively invite contrary opinions to get the challenge and debate going. Otherwise, you may be making a groupthink decision that hasn't been thought through properly. To do that, you must show humility and real trust in your colleagues. And as Malcolm Gladwell has shown in his book Outliers about the Korean air disasters, over-deference and the inability of inferior officers in the aircraft to challenge leadership led to several air disasters. And Matthew Syed's book, Black Box Thinking, tells how the inability of nurses to challenge consultants can lead to unnecessary deaths of patients. So being open and welcoming challenge from others prevents mistakes, enables an inclusive problem-solving and empowering culture to develop. Now, of course, when we ask for feedback, sometimes it goes wrong. Here's a child who was asked for feedback on his teacher. Not use collective punishment, as it is not fair on the many people who did nothing. And under the 1949 Geneva Convention, it's a war crime. And then finally, once you've listened to others, carefully listen to your inner voice and exercise your ethical muscle. And this is the key point I want to make, really. The more successful we are, there's a danger that we're less likely to ask others for advice. we've failed to exercise our ethical muscle and failed to listen to our own conscience. A clinical study illustrates that when charisma overlaps with narcissism, leaders tend to abuse their power, take advantage of their followers. They start to believe in themselves too much. They start to drink their own bathwater. They start to believe that the rules don't really apply to them. Instead of talking things through with others, they go ahead and assume that they are right. They believe so much in their own judgment that they flout the procurement process. They give a job to a relative without due process. They take additional money for themselves that should go to their school. They exclude lots of children from their school, but refuse to take any into their school because their school needs to be the best. And there are two things that can help to prevent this. The first is good, robust governance. And the second is a wise mentor. And instead, too often, all charismatic leaders get is an echo chamber of their own views coming back at them. But even if we're not charismatic leaders, many of us can start full of moral purpose and determination to change the world, but we can get ground down, become overly pragmatic, and lose that sense of conscience that we need. We mightn't even realize it's happened to us. Here's a quote from Middlemarch, from George Eliot. "From the multitude, there's always a good number who once meant to shape their own deeds and alter the world a little. The story of their coming to be shapen after the average is hardly ever told, even in their consciousness, till one day their earlier self walked like a ghost in its old home." We maybe started out wanting to change the world, but have we forgotten what our moral principles are? Does our old self walk like a ghost amongst us? And I